Europe was burning. Cities lay in ruins, the skies shook with thunderous bombardments, and armies clashed in battles that would determine the fate of the modern world. Yet beyond the front lines, another war was being waged, a quieter, invisible war of movement, distance, and supply. For an army to fight, it needed food, fuel, ammunition, and medicine. Without these, even the most powerful divisions would grind to a halt. The German High Command knew this well. And so, when Allied forces stormed into France after D-Day, German officers mocked them. They sneered at the seemingly fragile lifeline stretching back to the Normandy beaches. The Americans, they scoffed, may have tanks, may have planes, but they cannot feed them. They will choke on their own supply lines. What the Germans did not realize was that the Americans were about to unleash one of the most daring logistical operations in history. It would not be built on rails, nor on ships, nor even on the air. Instead, it would be forged on wheels, with roaring engines and relentless drivers thundering across Europe day and night. The lifeline would not merely survive, it would roar to life, defying every doubt, every sneer, every mocking word uttered in enemy headquarters. It was called the Red Ball Express, and in a matter of weeks, it would become the artery that pumped the lifeblood of war deep into the heart of Europe. A convoy of determination, grit, and unstoppable momentum, this was the machine that changed the course of the war. The German officers' laughter was not the laughter of joy but the laughter of arrogance, of men convinced that history itself was on their side. In smoke-filled headquarters tucked away in commandeered French chateaux, they leaned over maps of northern France, pointing to the thick black lines of railroads, the lifelines of European armies for generations. They had studied logistics all their careers. They knew that armies, no matter how large, no matter how heavily armed, lived or died by supply. And when they looked at the Americans flooding ashore at Normandy, they saw only a disaster waiting to happen. The beaches were distant, the ports shattered by Allied bombs, the roads choked with rubble. To them, the conclusion was inevitable. America, with all its industrial might, would choke on the very fuel and ammunition it had brought across the Atlantic. Their tanks would sit idle, their men would starve, and their advance into France would stall within weeks. The war, they thought, was still winnable. From their perspective, the arrogance seemed justified. For centuries, railroads had been the arteries of modern war. In the Franco-Prussian War, in the Great War of 1914, armies lived and died by how fast their trains could carry shells and bread to the front. Europe was built on steel tracks, and German officers believed deeply that nothing else could sustain an army of millions. To them, trucks were unreliable, fragile things, destined for breakdowns and traffic jams. They imagined endless convoys stranded on muddy French roads, fuel tanks empty, ammunition piles short, and soldiers left cursing their distant suppliers. They believed America was entering a logistical graveyard, and they mocked the very idea that trucks could replace trains. Their contempt was not just spoken, it was woven into their strategic assumptions. They were certain that logistics would strangle the Allied advance. But what the Germans could not see, what they refused to even consider, was the American instinct for improvisation. Where German staff officers clung to old methods, the Americans looked at their problem and dared to reinvent the rules of war. Railroads? They were bombed, wrecked, and unreliable. Ports? Destroyed by retreating Germans and mined beyond quick repair. The solution, as bold as it was unorthodox, was to put the entire weight of supply not on iron rails, but on rubber wheels. Thousands of trucks would move without pause night and day, carrying the lifeblood of war along a single relentless artery stretching from the Normandy beaches to the forward edge of battle. It was a plan so audacious, so improbable, that to German eyes it looked like madness. And yet, it was madness that worked. In the summer of 1944, while German officers sneered at maps, American logisticians were sketching a red circle, simple, unmistakable, on convoys that would soon dominate the roads of France. That circle became a symbol, painted on trucks, stenciled on signs, even whispered with awe by those who depended on it. It was the mark of the Red Ball Express, the convoy system that would breathe life into an advancing army. At first, it was just an experiment, a desperate attempt to solve an impossible problem. But as the weeks passed, the experiment became a lifeline, and the lifeline became a legend. The German mockery was not without consequence. Their officers scoffed so loudly, so publicly, that their soldiers believed it too. Many on the front lines were told that the Americans could not sustain their push, that soon the fuel would run out, that Patton's tanks would grind to a halt, and that the Allies would be forced to retreat back toward the beaches. German propaganda clung to the hope that time was on their side, that the enemy's own stomachs and engines would betray them. And in those first weeks after D-Day, as Allied divisions pushed against hedgerows and towns with little more than what they could carry, there were moments when even the most determined American soldier feared the Germans might be right. But then came the convoys. The sound of engines in the night, the endless columns of trucks thundering past fields and villages, carrying food, ammunition, and the black gold of war, gasoline. Soldiers at the front began to realize they were not alone, that somewhere behind them an invisible force was keeping them alive. The Germans, who had mocked so bitterly, soon found the reports filled with baffling numbers. American tanks advancing farther and faster than expected, artillery never running short of shells, rations flowing in abundance. The arrogance of their laughter gave way to confusion, and confusion slowly turned to alarm. How could an enemy feed so many, move so much, so quickly, without railroads? How could wheels replace rails? The truth was staring them in the face. America had changed the rules. The Red Ball Express was not simply a logistical trick, it was a revolution in motion. Each truck became a soldier in its own right, each driver a fighter in the unseen war of supply. The Germans had believed that America's weakness was its dependence on fuel, yet the convoys made fuel into a weapon. Where once mockery reigned, now disbelief spread. And disbelief is the seed of defeat. For when a commander no longer trusts his assumptions, when the laughter dies and doubt creeps in, the enemy has already begun to win. The Red Ball Express was not only delivering supplies, it was delivering shock, awe, and the realization that German arrogance had blinded them to a new kind of warfare. And so, in smoky headquarters where once they had laughed, German officers now bent over maps in silence. The red circle that had seemed like nothing more than a mark of desperation now represented a force they could not stop. The mockery had ended. In its place was respect, bitter and unspoken, for the relentless rhythm of American trucks that defied every expectation. The Red Ball Express had not only changed the course of supply, it had changed the course of the war. The Red Ball Express was a storm of wheels and grit, and its fury echoed across the battlefields of France. Imagine the scene: narrow country roads, scarred by bomb craters, lined with hedgerows and broken stone walls, echoing with the ceaseless growl of engines. Day and night, without pause, the convoys surged forward, carrying the lifeblood of war. Over 6,000 trucks, GMC Deuce-and-a-halfs and massive Diamond TS, roared across the countryside, their tires chewing through mud, their engines straining under impossible loads. These were not just vehicles, they were arteries, pumping gasoline, ammunition, food, and medicine directly into the beating heart of the Allied advance. And behind every wheel was a soldier whose endurance was tested more fiercely than any battlefield engagement. Most of the drivers were young. Boys barely out of high school, some who had never traveled farther than their hometowns, were now entrusted with keeping an army alive. And many of them were African American soldiers, men who carried not only the weight of supplies but also the burden of prejudice. Denied combat roles by a segregated system, they were handed the menial task of driving trucks. But what the world soon learned was that these men were no mere drivers, they were warriors of the unseen front. For 20 hours at a stretch, they gripped the wheel, their eyes fixed on the twisting roads ahead, exhaustion clawing at their bodies, yet refusing to surrender. They pushed on because failure meant the collapse of the very army they served. The Germans had mocked, but the Red Ball drivers answered with determination that could not be broken. The routes were treacherous. Bridges blown to pieces, villages still smoldering from battles, and stretches of road that wound through forests where enemy ambushes lurked in shadow. Convoys became targets for strafing Luftwaffe fighters, for mines left by retreating Germans, for sniper fire that cracked through the night. Yet the trucks kept moving. There was no time to stop. The drivers knew the rule: deliver, or the front collapses. When tires blew, they changed them in mud and darkness. When engines failed, they fixed them with bare hands, sometimes under fire. And when a truck was destroyed, another was pushed forward to take its place. The convoys were a living chain, and no break could be allowed. The schedule was brutal. Every morning, engines roared to life, exhaust pouring into the dawn air. Every night, headlights cut through fog and rain, turning the black countryside into rivers of light. Drivers fought sleep with coffee, with cigarettes, with sheer willpower. They tied rags around their heads to keep from nodding off. Some even kept the windows open in freezing winds so the bitter cold would sting them awake. To them, the road became endless, a blur of motion, yet they carried on. They carried on because Patton's tanks, those steel beasts that tore through German defenses, could not move an inch without the gasoline in their cargo. They carried on because artillery units depended on their crates of shells, because infantrymen in foxholes waited for the bread, the blankets, and the hope that their trucks delivered. The Red Ball Express did not simply move supplies, it moved survival. And then there was speed. The convoys became synonymous with urgency. Civilian traffic was forbidden from the designated routes, and military police cleared the way for the thundering lines of trucks. Signs marked with a red circle directed the drivers forward, and the men knew the rule: once you were on the Red Ball route, you did not stop. Convoys barreled down narrow lanes at breakneck speeds, their headlights burning through dust and darkness, the sheer momentum of the operation keeping it alive. To stand by the roadside as the convoys passed was to witness a force of nature, trucks roaring like waves in a storm, a relentless tide that nothing could slow. For the Germans, it was bewildering. Intelligence officers reported that the Americans seemed to possess an endless stream of fuel, ammunition, and food. Patton's tanks, which they had expected to halt, instead advanced with terrifying momentum. The Luftwaffe, already crippled, could do little against the sheer scale of the convoys. Sabotage teams tried to strike the roads, but even when one convoy was hit, another followed close behind. The Red Ball Express became unstoppable, its rhythm deafening, its presence overwhelming. It was not just supply, it was a weapon of shock. The men behind the wheel, though, paid the price. Exhaustion was their constant enemy. Many fell asleep while driving, their trucks veering into ditches, their bodies battered by crashes. Rain turned roads into rivers of mud, and breakdowns left men stranded in dangerous territory. Some never returned. Yet, despite the cost, the convoys endured. They endured because the mission was larger than any individual. Every man who drove, every truck that rolled forward, carried with it the weight of an army's future. The Red Ball Express was the invisible front line, and its soldiers, often unrecognized, bore the burden of victory on their shoulders. The Americans had turned mockery into momentum. What the Germans said was impossible had become the very reason their defenses collapsed. The Red Ball Express was not just a convoy system. It was proof that America's strength lay not only in tanks and planes, but in the willpower of ordinary men, in the engines of trucks, in the relentless drive to overcome. And it was proof that war is not only won in battles of steel and fire, but in the unseen struggles of roads and wheels, of sweat and grit, of drivers who refuse to stop. In a war remembered for its thunder of artillery and clash of steel, the Red Ball Express fought in a way that left no grand battlefield monuments, no sweeping tales of bayonet charges or tank duels, yet its presence was felt in every Allied victory. It was not glamorous, but it was relentless. Each truck became a heartbeat, each convoy a pulse in the vast body of the Allied war machine. The Germans, so sure of their predictions, had imagined a broken advance, armies stalled on empty fuel tanks, soldiers digging in hungry and desperate. Instead, what unfolded was a constant surge forward. The convoys turned prediction into ruin. It was logistics made flesh, a road-borne army of engines and grit that outpaced every expectation. And the Germans who once mocked, now faced the terrible truth. They had underestimated not just America's factories, but America's will. Every gallon of gasoline delivered, every crate of ammunition unloaded under dim headlights, was another blow against German strategy. The Red Ball Express supplied Patton's Third Army as it raced across France, fueling a momentum so fierce that German defenders were swept aside before they could regroup. Tanks that should have fallen silent roared on, artillery batteries that should have gone quiet thundered with uninterrupted fury. Behind every village liberated, behind every ridge seized, there were trucks that had clawed their way across hostile roads to deliver the means of victory. The rhythm of war had changed. No longer bound to rails, no longer predictable to German planners, the American advance flowed like a storm across the countryside, powered by men who never fired a shot in anger yet struck harder than most could imagine. The Germans tried to adapt. They sent saboteurs to mine the roads, to set traps, to harass the lifeline. They targeted bridges, knowing each span carried the weight of convoys. They sent aircraft to strafe, though the Luftwaffe was but a shadow of what it once had been. Yet for every attack, the Americans responded with improvisation. Bridges destroyed were replaced with Bailey bridges built in hours. Mines were cleared by engineers working shoulder to shoulder with the drivers they protected. Convoys were rerouted, schedules adjusted, yet the stream never stopped. To German eyes, it was uncanny. They had counted on time, on attrition, on logistics grinding the enemy to a halt. Instead, the enemy only accelerated. The mockery that had filled their headquarters months before turned into silence, then into resignation. For the men behind the wheels, victory was measured not in medals but in miles. They lived in perpetual exhaustion, sleeping in their trucks when they could, eating cold rations, and fighting the temptation to close their eyes even for a moment as the endless road stretched before them. Theirs was a war of motion, fought in rain and dust, in heat and freezing winds. Headlights pierced fog as convoys snaked across darkened hills, engines coughing and roaring like a chorus of determination. To the infantry huddled in foxholes, the sound of those engines was the sweetest reassurance, proof that they were not forgotten, proof that supplies would come. For the tank crews advancing into the unknown, it meant they could keep moving, could keep fighting, could keep winning. The Red Ball Express was the invisible promise that no matter how far they pushed, the lifeline would follow. By autumn, the truth was undeniable. The German war machine, once feared as the master of mechanized warfare, was being outpaced not just by American tanks but by American trucks. What had seemed impossible, sustaining an advancing army over hundreds of miles without railroads, had become reality. And in that reality, German strategy unraveled. Their officers, who had laughed at the idea of supply by wheels, now studied reports with grim faces. They saw towns falling in rapid succession, saw Allied armies advancing faster than their own exhausted divisions could retreat. They saw that their enemy had not only matched them in battle, but had surpassed them in the quiet, grinding war of supply. And there is no weapon more demoralizing than the realization that the very foundation of one strategy has collapsed. The Red Ball Express became a legend, though few outside the war truly understood its scale. It was more than trucks, more than fuel, more than crates of food. It was the embodiment of momentum, of an unstoppable advance that carried the Allies from the beaches of Normandy to the heart of Germany itself. It was the bridge between the promise of liberation and the reality of victory. And though the men who drove those convoys rarely received the recognition they deserved, history cannot deny them their place. They were the unsung heroes, the silent victors who made the impossible possible. In the end, the Germans were right about one thing: supply does determine war. They had placed their faith in rails, in rigid systems that crumbled under bombardment. The Americans placed their faith in wheels, in motion, in the grit of men willing to drive through hell to deliver what was needed. And in that difference lay the outcome of the war. The Red Ball Express was not simply a solution, it was the answer. It turned mockery into defeat, and it ensured that when the final battles came, it was not German steel but American resolve that held the field. The convoys of the Red Ball Express faded with the war's end, the trucks sold or abandoned, the roads returning to quiet countryside lanes. But their impact endured. For in every liberated city, in every battle won, there was the echo of engines that refused to die. And in the silence of German headquarters, where once laughter had filled the air, there remained only the bitter memory of an enemy they had underestimated, and the relentless roar of trucks that had changed the war forever.